Yeah, hello everybody in our macro course, and I think, will today finish the more or less first part of this lecture, where I introduced main macroeconomic variables: what is money, what is economic growth, what is unemployment, and so on. And first concepts, especially in monetary policy and money demand, we have already also slightly theoretically talked about. And yeah, especially this part in monetary policy, I want to talk with you about this topic, and especially also where do we come from, because I told you I was in the scientific staff of the economic advisors in Germany when all this started in 2008, 2009. There we thought, well, we have a crisis, we have a very deep crisis, and then we are coming back to normal times. Then we had the euro crisis, and then we had Corona, and now we are in the energy crisis and war in Europe. So normal times is now, if we look at the frequency of crisis in the former times, since World War II, then we could say maybe 15, 20 years or something like this. Very deep crisis. And right now we have 4 crises within, yeah, almost 15 years. So this is maybe then the new normal, or we will see how the world economy is moving in time. Okay, what we had discussed with respect to economic crisis, and especially with expectation indicators for an economic crisis, we talked about the yield curve, where we plot the interest rates. Oops, let's take black. Versus the maturity of bonds. And yeah, so in general, if you have very well functioning markets, then we would assume that over time, and that this is not lasting too long, that we have more or less the same interest rates for long-term and short-term bond investments. But in general, we see a dependence interest rates yield curve, which looks like this, that we have in general higher interest rates for long-term investments. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yes, I come to this in a minute. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, let me put this a bit down that you can see it. So now it's better. So this we will call a normal yield curve, and the explanation for this is, yeah, the so-called liquidity premium theory, that if somebody gives for a longer time his money away, then he loses liquidity during this time, and for this that he have during this time no liquidity or less liquidity, he wants to have, or she wants to have, a premium for this. So I think this is yeah, a quite normal thinking that this will be the general case. But we see also during time the so-called inverse yield curve, where short-term interest rates are larger than larger than long-term in your long-term investments, and in order to be complete, this we call then a flat yield curve, and here we have to maturity, and this is time. And then I argued that especially in this case, we could say that the probability that we are in a crisis or that a crisis is coming is quite high. And the explanation for this was the so-called market expectation theory, that we in general say, well, we have highly functional markets, and in this case, we always have a market equilibrium process, and that in general, in economic thinking, Homo economicus, that we are looking for these investments where we have the higher yield. But this then initializes, if there is one investment, so to speak, better than the other, many people move to this investment. So the demand for this bond will increase, and if the demand for this bond increases, of course the price of this bond increases. And this, of course, reduces then over time the yield of this investment, because to start this investment you have to pay a higher price if more people want to do this. And then if we say this equilibrium process works within perfect capital markets, then in general we should end up that all investments have the equal yield, and this was the deduction of this equal sign. And well, then we have to compare these two investments, and we have to compare it in the right way, and therefore we prolonged the short-term investment that we then did after 1 year, only 1 year maturity. I have my money, and in 1 year I can again invest for another 1 year, but I don't know this interest rate in the future. For the long-term investment, here in my example over 2 years, I know that I every year obtain 4%. This was in this example. And if this equal sign then holds, then I could derive that short-term expected interest rates equals the known long-term interest rates of today plus the difference of long-term interest rates minus the also known short-term interest rate today. So these two, so the right side of my equation, known variables today, and the left side is an unknown variable today. And this is, of course, something really nice, because then I could say that I can derive from the yield curve, oops, here I was, from the yield curve, something which could happen in the future, or I could say that from the yield curve I can derive the market expectations for short-term interest rates tomorrow. And then the argumentation is the following. If I have an inverse yield curve, then this bracket here, long-term minus short-term, is smaller than 0. So market expectations derived from the yield curve say that tomorrow we will have lower short-term interest rates. The second point I take is that I know that in general central banks want to steer short-term interest rates. So with their key interest rate, they want to go into the market and lower or cut short-term interest rates. So then I can say if market expectations are that tomorrow short-term interest rates will fall, I can also say, okay, market expect that the central bank will cut key interest rates tomorrow. And then the third point is, in which situation do I assume will a central bank cut interest rates? Well, interest rates are the price for credit, and they will lower this price for credits in a situation where the assumption is that it is a good thing to push the economy. Because remember the classical function of monetary policy that I make it more attractive to consume or to invest if I have lower interest rates, and that this can then push the real economy. So let us write down here. So inverse yield curve, then market expectations are that short-term interest rates fall, then central bank or expectations are that expectations are that central banks cut interest rates and central banks cut interest rates if we are in a downturn or crisis. So in the end, inverse yield curve is an expectation indicator for a crisis from this argumentation. Of course, and then we have to look in the data if this is true, and actually we find it almost for every in front of before every deep crisis we have seen. Unfortunately, not 3 months ahead, but only some weeks ahead when this crisis events then really happened. And therefore I argued we should have a look at this part of the actual yield curve if this short-term part is moving upwards faster than the long-term part here. yesterday the new forecast of the economic advisors was published. Maybe you have heard this, and they, well, forecasted not a very deep crisis, but a crisis, I think, minus zero point 0.2 GDP growth, where is their forecast. Well, and now I want from the money markets, I want to show you some other indicators where you should have a look at it. And another one is the so-called spread between the Euribor 3 months and the EONIA, or better to speak, the so-called ESTR spread. So this is a 3 months interest rate, and this is the overnight interest rate. So actually, this interest rate is what central banks want to steer. Question? Oh, sorry. Sorry, I forgot. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. There, I have to admit, we had to look more deeply into the data, but I would say that, well, I don't think that you can really say with a probability of 70 or 80%, because then yeah, but because the problem is always how do we react when this crisis indicator and other crisis indicator show that there is something, because actually we can do anything about it. We can do something against this crisis. And if we go back to the financial crisis in summer 2008, there it was not only the inverse of the yield curve that, but more or less every expectation indicator of the business cycle of an economy in the whole world, they all, yeah, showed a downturn. But the big problem in this time, in summer 2008, was that also every indicator was more or less at an all-time high. So we had, I think, it started in June, July, that we had this turning point. But still, the level of these expectation indicators was still higher than every number we have seen before. So then the general expectation was then, well, maybe, yeah, we have some saturation or something in our economy, but we are still at an all-time high, only 1 point below the number 3 months before, and therefore, yeah, we really didn't see that this was the initialization of a deep downturn. Actually, in summer, I think, do I have the, yes, here it is. This is this blue here. This we would then also see in the key interest rate. We have here a step upwards in interest rates in summer 2008. I think it was July or August, where we increased interest rates at the ECB. And right now, we know that in September, 1 month later, we had the Lehman bankruptcy, and in October, we cut it then here interest rates down to 1% and afterwards to 0%. So within all these surroundings, this framework, we just couldn't believe that there will be a crisis. We always talked about, well, there is something in the financial markets, but this will have no or only a small impact on the real economy. So on the other hand, if especially the governments see these signals and then they start to react, and then no crisis will come, then we as a society or we as people then also sometimes say, well, everybody said there is coming something, and then nothing has come, and therefore, why did you react? And this is the general problem in social sciences. We cannot do the experiment reacting and not reacting and then comparing afterwards. And therefore, it is it is quite hard to really specify an inverse yield curve and then let's say 80% probability that there will be a crisis. But I think from historical data, we really can say that an inverse yield curve is a very strong signal that I have to be careful. That so from the, I think it is a really good qualitative indicator. Because, well, then of course we can count every time when we had an inverse yield curve, and then we can count all crises, and then we can calculate just a descriptive probability. But I wouldn't recommend then, if there we will maybe see 75% or so, that we take this probability then for the future, because then you have to really carefully look, how do our governments, how do our societies react in this situation? Yeah, of course, definitely. Okay. Then let's go to this indicator. So this ESTR, this is the overnight interbanking, both interbank interest rates. So these are more or less the interest rates. With these interest rates, banks interchange their assets, their capital. And this one is the interest rate the central bank wants to steer, and this one is the interest rate. So this is maybe the main reference for the banking sector. Main reference interest rate for the banking sector. So if, for example, you take all the derivatives we have, there we have derivatives where you exchange interest rates. There you say, well, I have a certificate with a fixed interest rate for the next 5 years, and then I can change it into another certificate with a flexible, where I look every month or every day, what is the interest rate, what do I have to pay. And if you compare these different certificates with each other, then mainly these 3-bor Euribor, or if you take the whole world, then it's a 3 months LIBOR interest rate. This is one of the main interest rates where you look in the interbanking sector. And if these two interest rates falling apart, then this is, of course, then also a really good stress indicator, because if this would be much higher than the Euribor, then this is more or less a sign that the central bank is losing control about the money markets. And we see here, this is the financial crisis. This 1-2 years afterwards, this is the euro crisis. This is Greece. This is the bankruptcy of Greece. These are the problems in South and the southern part of the Eurozone, in Spain, in Italy, and Portugal, and so on. So euro crisis. And then, and this is maybe, okay, this is good. This is a quite good example. Is there a crisis coming or not? Because this here is Corona. Well, we see something, but it is, compared to these two, not the amount of difference we had in the other crisis. And maybe this is due to the fact that we reacted very fast. You remember we talked about this. We started in the beginning of March, less than 100 infected people in Germany, and 6 weeks later we went in the first very hard lockdown. So in this case, maybe we can say capital markets were stressed. They showed us, well, there is something really bad coming. And within the Corona crisis, we reacted as governments very fast. And this is my opinion. In Germany, in the first part of the Corona crisis, I think we reacted in a very good way. Afterwards, I would doubt that it was still very good, because then opening, closing, opening, closing, this is of course not a good way to deal with all these problems and your economy. But here maybe we can say that we really worked more or less through this crisis in a quite good way. If we go back, the expectations in the starting time, in the beginning or in summer 2020, were that we maybe have a drop in GDP of almost 10%. And then we ended up with not 4%. Although we just closed more or less our whole economy. Compared to what we have done, the downturn was not very large. So, and now, here we are. And if we compare, so let's say energy, crisis, or war in Ukraine. And if we look at the spread, then this spread is almost as high as in the euro crisis. So I think this is a quite good sign that we have to be very careful in the next time. Okay, before we go on to other indicators which show what happens today, I forgot, this is an overview what we have invented in monetary policy during the last 15 years. So actually, I had in 2008, I had to write down what the central banks, especially the ECB, invented in these months in fall and winter 2008. And these were, yeah, many instruments we haven't thought in university about in the years before. So if I would have if I would have asked my supervisor in my thesis, well, let's think about 10 years of zero nominal interest rates. What does it mean for an economy? Then he would have shaken his head and said, well, you could think about it, but it has no practical matter to think about such a thing. So this was then more or less the first dramatic reaction that we cut interest rates, especially nominal interest rates, down to 0%. And also, before all these crises have started, we had a mechanism, and we talked about this when we talked about the money multiplier, that the private banks need central bank money because of the regulation. And the mechanism was designed in the following way, that the ECB calculated the next month, I will give in the private banking sector, let's say 50 billion euros. But the banking sector didn't know that this amount was 50 billion. So then we had a key interest rate, let's say 4%, and then there was an auction. The first private bank said, then maybe I want to have 500 million euros for 4.3%, because they really needed these central bank money. Another private bank could have said, well, I want to have 2 billion euros, but I'm not so stressed. Maybe I can get also this money from another bank, which has already central bank money, so I bid only 4.1%. And all this did the private banks. And then the central bank went down and looked, okay, there are private banks with a bid of 4.3. They get at first the money, and then we aggregated it, every bid, until we have our limit of 50 billion euros. And if then there are still open bids, these banks didn't get any money. So they have to look for their money then in the private market. So there was an auction process. So there was a probability that you did not get the amount you need. And this we also changed dramatically since the financial crisis, because now there is actually no mechanism anymore. You just go to the central bank and you say, I want to have 2 billion euros, and then you get these 2 billion euros for the key interest rate, which the central bank has set. And if we go back to this auction process, I would doubt that we will see this. But also, you don't get these central bank money for nothing. You have to give some securities for this. And these are rated AA, single A, or something like this. This was before the financial crisis. But then the crisis came, and then, of course, the private banks did not have anymore enough assets rated single A plus double A or something like this. So we downgraded the rating requirement for these assets, which you have to give to the central bank in exchange for central bank money. And this we also have to keep in mind. All these assets are right now lying at the central bank, double B investment grade or something like this. So there is still a high risk which is in the balance sheet of the central banks. And then also we talked about the main refinancing operations, that they have a maturity of 1 week, less than 1 month. And during these dramatic times, the private banks really needed longer maturity so that they can really plan and that something like Lehman does not happen again, so that we really reduce the probability of a bank run. And for this, the central banks introduced longer term refinancing operations for the key interest rates up to 1 year. And one big problem was also that for international markets, especially the banks in Europe, did not only need for their cash management euro, they of course also needed US dollar. But not every bank could go to the Federal Reserve to get the US dollar. So we had instruments where we had a direct exchange between the European Central Bank and the Federal Reserve, so that more or less in Europe you had also access more or less directly to US dollar. These were these Euro-US dollar swaps. And what else then happened? We are moving on in time, and especially we had really very big problems, especially in the Italian banking sector. This Italian banking sector was also very close to a collapse. And for this will we see in a minute, looking at the development of the European, of the ECB balance sheet. This were now not only 1 year, but 2, 3-year tenders of an amount of 500 billion euros. So if you take these two together, 1 trillion, almost one third of the German GDP. And this tender was taken especially from the Italian and with a lower amount from the Spanish banking sector, because these had really hard problems, and there they got the money for the key interest rate for 3 years. And this happened just in January 2012, where we just dropped the minimum reserve requirement. And what does it mean for the money markets? That we cut down the reserve requirement from 2% to 1%. What does it mean? Why is it also an expansionary instrument in the money markets? Okay, but what happens? But what happens directly? What have we calculated? Yeah, yes, they can lend more. And what does it mean for the money markets in an amount? Afterwards, this was maybe in the medium or in the long run, but the direct effect. Yes, on not twice as much, but we calculated that the money multiplier is just 1 over R. So, and if we cut it, of from 2% to 1%. So if R is cut from 2 to 1%, 1 over R doubles. So, and this is of course then also a push in liquidity. Okay, and then we come to the very, very famous whatever it takes speech of Mario Draghi, the former president of the ECB. And this was at a monetary conference in London. This was not a really special conference, but then some journalists asked him, because the spreads of Italian bonds have risen dramatically. So in Germany, we had more or less zero interest rates for German bonds, and Italy had to pay in these times in summer 2012, I think 4 or 5%. So a really, really high premium. And then we also have to know that the debt ratio, the public debt ratio of Italy is around, I think, 140%. So more than twice as large as in Germany. And then he was asked, what are you doing about these spread of Italian interest rates? And then his answer was, within our mandate, the ECB is ready to do whatever it takes to preserve the euro. Because many people talked about if not only Greece, but also Italy, the third largest economy in the Eurozone, will collapse, then this will also be a reason that maybe the euro will collapse. And the second part is, in my view, very important, and believe me, it will be enough. So what he announced, whatever private investors will do, and they, so to speak, they speculated against the Italian government, and with this they also speculated against the euro, because the collapse of Italy would also mean that the euro will have a really, really hard problem. And he said, well, we will, so to speak, print money, and we will go into the market and we will buy Italian bonds, because if you have this additional demand of the central bank, then of course the yields, we argued about this before, will drop down. And what then happens was that nothing happened. That more or less the capital market believed this promise. So the European Central Bank did not need to start to buy Italian bonds, because the capital markets, which wanted to bet against the government, they believed we cannot earn anything, because if we still speculate against the euro or against Italy, then we will lose money, because the ECB will step in. So this is maybe one of the most famous experiments, so to speak, in real economy, where we really saw how important are our expectations and the expectations of capital markets in general. We had 30 or almost 40 years before that, we had a speculative attack against the British pound. They had a fixed exchange rate to the German mark. There, the investors, they betted that you could not hold the Bank of England, you cannot hold this fixed exchange rate. And in this time, the bet of the capital markets, they have won. So after that, the the British pound had to go down, and yeah, some people became there then billionaires because they have won. But in this time, they believed, and actually nothing happened, and only this announcement at the press conference brought the spreads of the Italian bonds interest rates down again quite close to the German interest rates. But maybe a last one sentence, maybe this functions only one time. We will see. We will see it in a minute. Yeah, okay. So if you want to read this the full speech, you can click on this. Well, anyway, not in that amount which he here announced, but we started then in a low amount to buy government bonds, but the really start of buying very much government bonds was in 2015, and since 2015 we really started to buy more or less an amount of 60, and this changed over time. Sometimes it was only 20, another time it was 80 billion euros, and we bought this amount every day. Then this was actually also increased additionally during the Corona crisis of about additionally 1.7 trillion euros. And this one, he just asked it, a quantitative tightening, we, yeah, more or less started in July this year. So we stopped this process of buying every month government bonds, but we stopped only to buy new government bonds. So if the ECB right now has bought, let's say, for example, a government bond of Germany with a maturity of 5 years in 2017, then the ECB is reinvesting in a new German government bond when this government bond matures this summer. So the European Central Bank, and we will see this, is not leaving the market. So we are at a very high level. And right now, the mechanism is like this, that we will be still at this high level we have reached right now. So it is really important that we only stopped to buy new government bonds, but we do not leave the market. So every investment we have done in history will be redone when this bond matures. And of course, then also in July 2022, we started, and we talked about this, with an increase of interest rates. And I think the next days or weeks, we will see also this interest rate raise of the European Central Bank. Well, Then let's have a look at the development of key interest rates of the European Central Bank. And the red line is the overnight interbanking interest rate, EONIA or ESTR. And this is what we want to steer. And actually, if you have a look at the first 10 years after the introduction of the euro, then we can say that this functions quite good, because the red line and the black line, this is the key interest rate, of the ECB. We don't see it. Why do we don't see it? Well, because the red line is just more or less lying on the black line. And we also see that the fluctuation is just within this corridor of marginal lending facility and deposit facility. So more or less, market interest rates are just there where I want them to be. And then financial crisis. And what then happened? That the red line moved down to the blue line. So what we right now have is that market interest rates do not follow the key interest rate as we have introduced it as the interest rate of main refinancing operations, but it follows the deposit facility. So in practice, more or less, right now, we can say that this is, in quotation marks, the new key interest rate, because this is what the private markets take as the reference. And we will see if this red line will go up again to the black line in the next month or in the next years, or if we are in a new situation that we maybe have to speak of the deposit the interest rate of the deposit facility as the right, so to speak, key interest rate. And this was then also here the reason that we have these negative interest rates. And therefore, we can more or less interpret it. Why does it function? Well, of course, holding very much money at home, because money has an interest rate of 0%. So I had an alternative. I could give as a private bank the money with a deposit facility to the European Central Bank, but there I had to pay 0.5 minus 0.5%. I could also put it at home, but of course, taking millions or billions of euros, then I have transaction costs to hold it at home. And there, the interpretation is that these transaction costs are more or less equal to paying 1%, giving it to the European Central Bank. Okay, but then let's see what is today the amount of what the ECB has accumulated, bought during the last 6-7 years in the government bond market in Europe. And this we see here. So this is roughly 3.5 trillion euros. And now again, we want to know how to interpret these numbers. Well, we know, and this we estimated, I think, GDP of the Eurozone This was, if I remember it right, roughly 13 trillion euros. And the public debt of the Eurozone, this is roughly 90%. So then, more or less, we have public debt of roughly, let's say, 12 trillion euro. Well, and now if we take the proportion, 3.5 trillion euros are lying, so to speak, in the cellar of the European Central Bank of this public debt. So then ECB holds roughly 25 to 30% of public debt in the Eurozone. And what does this mean? No, definitely not. And this is actually here that you have to look at this. Well, it's also my opinion that during these crises, there was more or less sometimes no alternative to go into the market via the central banks. But right now, it seems to me that the central banks think, well, it functioned that well, let's stay there. And it is not only 5% or something like this, it is really almost a third or a fourth to a third of holding public debt in the central bank balance sheet. Yes. And this I forgot to say. Well, there is, in general, it is prohibited that the European Central Bank just buy single European single government bonds of members of the Eurozone. This is the famous no bailout clause when founding the euro. And for this, that this is allowed, we said then, well, we do not buy specific countries. We do not buy only Italian or only Spanish government bonds. We buy, due to the capital key of the European Central Bank, all government bonds in the Eurozone. And remember, Germany is roughly 25% of the Eurozone. So buying every month 15 billion government bonds means we have to buy every month 60 billion. We have to buy 60 in total. 25% of 60 is 15 billion government bonds of Germany. So also right now the European Central Bank holds 30% of the German public debt. And remember, we performed very well after the financial crisis. We really didn't need that the European Central Bank buys our government bonds. So we really made a good profit out of it. And this we should also not forget. But what does it mean? We are holding our own debt. So we ask more or less ourselves for credit. And this is just printing money, taking this printed money and buying with this printed money goods and services. And I think from this here, we should not be surprised, and actually that this is 25 to 30% of our own public debt, we should not be very surprised that prices increase. And you ask, how does the balance sheet of the European central banks look like? Well, here, before the financial crisis, we started with roughly 1 trillion euros. Then it moved up. This year is the 2-3 year tender for Italy and Spain. Well, and here we see the central bank moved out of the market again. After this 3 years, there was no revolving investment. So therefore, we went down, and then we have here 2015, the monthly program to buy government bonds started. And then we have here this plateau just in front of, just before the Corona crisis, and this is the additional PEPP, Pandemic Purchase Program, within the Corona crisis. And now we are here at this level of almost 9 trillion euros in the balance sheet. And I would doubt that this is really a good idea to stay as an institution still in that amount in the private markets, because this would be, in my opinion, something like where we have it, that we always try to manipulate the market with something like this. And this, if we look in history, I think doesn't work. Okay, and then one last diagram, and this is maybe my favorite diagram. These are the interest rates of 10-year government bonds. And you remember, this is maybe more or less the reference interest rate if we talk about where are the interest rate in some country. Then we look at the interest rate of 10-year government bonds. And what we see here is all the members today, members of the Eurozone. And what we see here, of course, before we introduced the euro, we had different interest rates for different countries. So in history, Germany had always very low interest rates, and Italy, France, and so they had to pay higher interest rates at the financial markets, at the capital markets. And then the euro is introduced here. These are the new members then, especially from the eastern part of Europe. And all the members until the financial crisis more or less paid the same interest rates. Before financial crisis, all Eurozone members paid, oh sorry, my English, same interest rates. And what does it mean? What is an interest rate of a government bond? An interest rate, yeah. Yes, and what is the reason that Italy in history had to pay higher interest rates than Germany? Yes.
Greece one is mean that you buy a government bond from Greece and you would get 30% on your money and in euro?
Yes. Yes. And this was then, of course, although the bankruptcy, then that we don't have a legal insolvency of the Greece of Greece was then constructed in that way that private investors, they didn't had a cut, but all banks, they had a cut of 50%. So if you had as the things as a private bank, the German bank, the Deutsche Bank, or whatever, if you had an asset, Greece a government bond, from one day to another, you had to depreciate you had to depreciate it with 50%. So if it was 1 billion, the next day it was only 500 million. Yeah, but let's go back. You were totally right, because the expectation was that that Italy as an economy is not that stable as Germany. Well, so interest rates are nothing more than a risk premium. And what does it mean if every country in the Eurozone have to pay the same interest rate? What are the expectations of capital markets? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, and if we go in this time, could we say that economically all countries perform more or less in the same way? Of course not. Of course, we still had difference, especially between Southern Europe and especially between the midst of Europe. So the risk, of course, was still different. But what does it mean? Capital markets say the risk of repayment is the same. So this means capital markets did not believe the no bailout clause of the euro. So they just said, if in some country happens anything, the other countries will step inside and will help these countries. In opposite, what we have written down in our contracts. Well, this was then the problem with Italy, but if Greece collapses or another small country, we could doubt that then also the whole euro would crash. Yep. Oh no, it's not Italy. Where do we have Italy? Italy is Italy is here, a brown one. This one, this is Greece, yeah. This is Greece, but in Italy this is here, and here's also the 2012. So here we also, this is Italy, and we down here. These are the almost 4%, 400 basis points we see here. Well, and these were the expectation of capital markets, and well, we have to admit capital markets were right. In case Greece collapsed, more or less Italy, Spain had also huge problems. Remember these 3-year tender? We just moved in, and we moved in also with buying government bonds in an amount of 20, 40, 60 billion euros per month. Yeah. Okay, and therefore, this is one of my favorite charts, because here we also see the power of capital markets. And to bet against capital markets is, yeah, you may you have a very high risk, and so I hope I could also show you some interesting parts of these aggregates and important variables in macroeconomics. And yeah, we will see what happens in the future. And maybe you have a look at these key indicators. Okay, done. That it was for today. And let's see next week. Okay, I put on my web page some exercises. Maybe you can have a look at the first exercises, because before we start with the theoretical part, we will redo some exercises to repeat the topics we have talked about. Okay.